Well,
Well,
hello. How are you, Ms. Miller?
very good. How are you?
Excellent.
Good.
Excellent. And I'm going to just make sure that it does say recording already. So I think we're okay. Yeah, it's on. Good. So I want to thank you so much for being here today. This is going to be
Oh,
a
sure.
great discussion. I'm going to say this again when Mr. Craig gets on here, but I just love your book.
Thank you.
I love it. And I'm going to make sure the audience knows why, when we send this tape out to folks. So that'd be
That'd be
great.
great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Craig. So nice to see you.
Oh, nice to see you. I was just I still can never get this room right where my face looks like it's like bright red or something. I can never get it right. I was playing with the lighting and everything.
Yeah, you look great. Don't worry about it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to have you both here. And I know the hour will go very quickly, so we might as well get started. Just a friendly reminder, we are recording. And
Sure.
so let me identify myself. And what I will do then is introduce the book in terms of the title, give your bios, and then we can begin those questions. And again, thank you, Mr. Craig, for all your great emails. I think it's been very helpful. So
Gladly. Thank you.
you're so welcome. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Kimora from John Jay College of Criminal Justice here in New York City. And I was asked to do a book talk with these fine two folks that are here today, Ms. Quinn Miller and Mr. Gary Craig, who will be talking to us today about what I consider, of all the books I've ever read, one of the best books I've ever read in terms of its heartwarming, amazing energy and her journey. The title of the book, ladies and gentlemen, is The Prison Guard's Daughter, My Journey Through the Ashes of Attica. And immediately when I got a copy of it, I was very thrilled to see the Sister Prejean, who I have met personally, endorse the book. She says, a remarkable tale of healing and reconciliation. This book tells us that our true angels can prevail. And I agree wholeheartedly. I will now read the bio information that they have provided so that we can then talk to the authors. So I want to begin, of course, with Deanne Quinn Miller's bio. And I'm going to actually read this entirety because it is so helpful. Deanne Quinn Miller is co-founder of the Forgotten Victims of Attica and the daughter of Correctional Officer William Quinn, the first casualty of the Attica prison riot. With Miller's leadership, the Forgotten Victims secured $12 million in reparations for its members, counseling for all who sought it, and an annual memorial at the prison. The organization continues to push for other goals, the unsealing of the remaining thousands of pages of non-public riot records, and an apology from the state of New York. Miller has previously worked as the executive director of the Genesee Veteran Support Network and received the State Women Veterans in the Justice System Award in 2016 and the Women of Distinction Award in 2017 for her work with veterans. She graduated cum laude from the University of New York at Buffalo with a BS in Consumer and Family Studies. Since 2014, she has been the program coordinator for the Veterans Defense Program of the New York State Defenders Association, a program that provides support and legal aid to struggling veterans who become involved in the criminal justice system. Miller lives in Batavia, New York, and is married with 2 daughters. I welcome you, Ms. Miller, to our program.
Thank you for having me here today.
You're welcome. And I also want to read the bio of the co-author, Gary Craig. He's an investigative reporter with the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. He has won national awards for his reporting and writing, including multiple awards for reporting on prison conditions and for more than 24 state, regional, and national honors. He is the author of 7 Million, A Cop, A Priest, A Soldier for the IRA, and the still unresolved Rochester Brinks heist. Craig covered the resolution of the decades-long lawsuit filed by Attica inmates against the state. Since 2000, he has written extensively about Attica, reporting on the birth and the work of the Forgotten Victims of Attica and the efforts to open Attica records. Craig lives in Rochester, New York, and he is married with 2 daughters. And Mr. Craig, I also welcome you to the program today.
Oh, thanks so much for having us.
You're welcome. So I'm going to begin, as you know, with the questions that I have given both of you ahead of time. And I think it's appropriate to actually begin with the question that is, please tell us, if you both would, a bit about yourselves in the context of the book that you have written. Who would like to go first?
Do you want to start, Dee?
Sure, I'll start.
Yeah.
So, I wrote my book is a memoir, and, it's about my life, as a child, growing up in the aftermath of Attica. It's about my journey, about learning about my father and the reconciliation that comes with that. Putting the pieces together of my father's life to kind of find out what kind of person he was. And I will tell you, it's been an amazing journey, one with many unexpected twists and turns.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Mr. Craig.
Yeah, I come to the book through Dee, obviously. I met Dee in 2000. I was working on the inmate settlement. The inmates had sued in the aftermath of Attica, and the state finally agreed to a settlement with them of about $12 million. And as you said in the bios, the Forgotten Victims of Attica was born then, and I met Dee then, and her story is just always I found inspiring and touching and moving. And as I've said a number of times since we did the book, or while we're doing the book, that I never thought that I would want to sort of co-write, somebody else's story. Not that, I actually just didn't know if I'd be any good at it, to be honest. But her story was the one that I wanted to do, just because I do find it so inspirational on so many levels.
I agree with you 100%. That's the word I was really looking for earlier when we were talking, Ms. Miller. Inspirational, yeah. And could you elaborate on that a little bit, Mr. Craig, about why it was so inspirational to you personally?
Sure, and it's interesting that I think now even more so, Dee and I started talking about this 10 years ago, and then the time wasn't really right. And then the 50th anniversary was approaching this year, and we said, okay, do we want to give it a shot? And we reached out to an agent and finally with a publisher, and then we had like 5.5 weeks to write the book. So it was done before the anniversary came. And I just, it's her willingness to sort of cross these sort of, calcified lines that we have, whether it's, law and order lines and inmate racial lines, and Black folks and white folks, and that's sadly, I think 10 years ago when we first started talking about it, and now that there's even in some ways more division in many ways, and people just get so firm in their opinions and aren't willing to listen to what others have to say. And Dee's story, and Dee is always, I've just thought, a lesson for all of us that when you're there are always more than one side of the story, and the more often you seek that out, the better you're going to be, and the more honest version of things you're going to learn.
Thank you for that answer, because I think that really is poignant. And it's interesting too. I was thinking of bringing up some of this aspect that you're talking about, Mr. Craig, about the divisiveness and why this book is so important, because it bridges that gap so well. I mean, I get chills just thinking about it, seriously. And so I really want to thank you both publicly for writing this book and explaining that journey, and the transformation, Ms. Miller, that you went through is so profound. I say to myself, if everybody could read this book and understand that it is important to forgive, it is important to transform, it is important to find out the truth. What's your response to that?
I totally agree. I mean, I think, from my book, I was brought up in a small town with a lot of racial issues, a lot of Black-white issues, a lot of good guy, bad guy, a lot of good cop, bad cop kind of a thing. So, I lived a lot of my life within that, box, if you will, because I was a child. But as soon as I got older, I always kind of had this feeling that, what was being told me wasn't exactly the story of it, which just made me want to just, investigate. And I think that in our lives, we have a responsibility to ourselves and to others, right? To not just, to take what's said and just assume that that's the correct information, especially when you have that little intuition in you that's saying there's something more to this, you need to continue digging. So when I started digging, I came upon so much more information than I was ever given. And much of the information came from people that I never in a million years would have expected to get information from, which would be, inmates that, survived the riot. And so I had to reach over, boundaries, which were certainly very strong within my family household. But, as you get older, it's your responsibility to either choose to live within that, which was too small for me, or, go out and find out what there is. And the information that you get will come from a variety of sources, people who you never expected to bring you information. And I think it's our responsibility to be open to that information, especially if you want to learn the truth.
Right. Oh, I couldn't have said it better. The trick is, as we both all know, is that many people don't think that way about any issue in life. They're so closed, not interested in learning, and they don't have that inner voice somehow, I don't think. I mean, we're not them, so we don't know. But, it would be like saying, if somebody has that inner voice that says to them, I need to know what the truth is, and they ignore it. What is going on with people? I'm flustered at that. And I guess I say that so much because of all the prison work I do. I'm a correctional educator. And so I've spent many years teaching people in prisons and jails and trying to bring a sense of dignity to it. And, but I'm conditioned to think, oh, well, certain people in the prison don't have any empathy. Well, they do. And they can. And they can also learn it if they don't have it. And it goes on both sides of the, fence, so to speak. It's interesting. Your book that the two of you have written together is profound on many levels. And I want to explore this a little bit more. But before I do, Mr. Craig, did you want to add anything to what we've just said?
No, I mean, I other than maybe just following up with what you said, is that you have in the prisons, and Dee has been in the prisons, and I've been in the prisons, all of us sort of in different roles, that I think we do as a society too oftentimes have this kind of vision of what folks are in the prisons, and then we get locked into that and unwilling to sort of move from that. So just other than to agree wholeheartedly with what you said, is that we have to sort of open our minds and hearts to on that too. Yeah. I was looking at my second question that I've sent both of you, and the question is, why did you write the book? And Ms. Miller, I think you've already stated why, but was there anything that you wanted to add to that? Because I think the point is really well taken. In other words, let me rephrase this. How can we use this book in the context of education and other forums? Where do we need to have people read this book that maybe are not reading it? Let's try that.
Okay. Well, I think that everybody should read this book.
Of course.
Fully on board.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many things about it that, yes, it's a memoir, it's a person's story, but it's a person's story who, like I said earlier, kind of lived a small life in a small town and had small thoughts. And then when you get older, you have the right to choose how it is you're going to be living your life and how you're, going to see the world. And, I originally started writing this book. When I originally started writing things down, I wrote it down. I started writing and taking notes because I wanted my children to know who their grandfather was, because he was murdered in a prison, doesn't mean that he was a bad guy, or he was a bad officer, or that necessarily, bad people kind of did this thing. But there was a reason why I wanted to write things down, because I wanted, people in our family, my nieces and nephews and so on, to have the knowledge about, their grandfather.
I see this book as, for lack of a better way to put it, and I don't mean to have you interpret this in the wrong way, either one of you, I see it as a self-help book. I see it as a book that can be used in therapeutic settings for people who have gone through post-traumatic stress syndrome in prisons, or who have been violated on some level in the prison or jail setting. How does that strike both of you? Does that make sense?
I think that strikes me. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because just writing this, I've been diagnosed with PTSD. And just writing this book at times was incredibly difficult. You know, just tears rolling down my face, you know, just revisiting so much of this. And I knew it was going to be difficult to write it. What I find to be more difficult, and I think from a therapeutic setting, it's a little bit like, you know, pulling the Band-Aid off this kind of enormous wound with a small Band-Aid, but I have to rip it off every time I have to talk about it. But I think it's something that does need to be talked about, and that people can understand that you can go through trauma in your childhood, but it doesn't necessarily have to define you, right? Even if, you know, you gotta navigate your life. This is your life. It's one life, and this is what we get. So you have to navigate to find help, and to be the person that you want to be, regardless of what has been in your past. And I think that you can rise above it and think differently and be differently, and be open-minded, and have a really fulfilling life, regardless of trauma. For me, that's what I found this to be.
Thank you for that answer. That's fantastic. Mr. Craig, what's your interpretation of this in terms of its therapeutic?
We're frozen.
I thought I had lost everybody for a minute there.
Oh,
Okay, froze up for a second.
Yeah, me too. Okay, it wasn't just me. Okay.
there you go.
Yeah. I couldn't, what Dee said, I don't think I can add anything to that. That was just, yeah, beautiful. And so,
Yeah,
and I just want to note too,
okay,
Dee's
thank you.
right shoulder is actually the photo of her dad, for people who
I know.
may see.
Oh.
Yeah, over her right shoulder is the photo of, you know, Bill Quinn. So.
He's always here.
That's great. That's great. I actually had tears throughout reading most of the book, because it felt like I was on a journey.
You're breaking up a little on me, Professor. Is that happening with you, Dee?
She's breaking up, yes.
Okay.
Uh-oh, not good. Well, we'll see if am I okay now? Hopefully it's all right. Seems okay here. All right.
Now she's frozen.
Oh,
Yeah.
now I'm frozen. Oh, that's not good.
We can hear your voice. It's just the
Okay.
frame is frozen.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll continue, and hopefully it'll take care of itself. All right. So I think we even answered the question already about
My face is just getting redder. Not
Oh,
just because of the room. Not truly getting redder.
Yeah.
Just the lighting. Oh, there you, I think, oh, thought you're
Okay.
back.
Yeah, it'll probably fix itself. There we go, I hope. The third question I was going to ask is, why is this book important for everyone to read? And I think we've already answered that, unless anybody wanted to answer it. I'll tell you why I think it's important that we read the book, because it goes back to what Mr. Craig was really
Oh, sorry.
talking
Okay, I can hear you now. You're back.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, what I'll do is I'll edit this if there's breaks in there, you know, later.
Okay, your image is still frozen, but I can hear you.
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully it'll take care of itself. I have no clue why it's doing that. I've done 100 Zoom meetings, so don't know.
Okay, sure.
But anyway, we shall prevail. So I would mention why I think this book is important for everybody to read, not only in terms of the therapeutic sense, but also I think it even goes beyond that. It's a testament to transformation. It's a testament to the transformation that this planet needs to make to come together and be peaceful. And, you know, when I think of all the work I've done in prisons and jails and seen all the violence that I've seen in there, most people, if they have not had the kind of exposure that the three of us have had to correctional institutions, would not think of that as a place of healing or as potential healing on the outside, having been there or know somebody in there. So I just wanted to add that because I think that's important. I'm going to go to the fourth question. How does your book aid correctional officers and students of correctional programs who want to be correctional officers in the world? Who would like to take that one?
Yeah,
I can start. Or, yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
I
We may say the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, my book provides some insight into how prisons were run in the 70s, you know. And since the riot, we do use within the Department of Corrections, you know, the video of the retaking is used in the training of officers, of our new officers. And I think many, many things have been put into place for corrections officers and for inmates, because honestly, they're both marking time together. And so if time, you know, while they're in there can be done well, constructively, I think that it's a win-win. And so I think we've learned a lot of things from Attica, but I think, it's a discussion, that I hope the book, brings forward and has, we as a community, how we envision prisons and prisoners in the future.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Mr. Craig?
Yeah, I just agree wholeheartedly with what Dee said. I think the book and the people that Dee encountered along the way, some of the inmates who helped her sort out, her dad and what happened at Attica and what happened with her dad, show that, if we want to create a stereotype, as some people do, that the stereotypes are wrong. And there are people that also stereotype corrections officers, and I hope that the book also sort of breaks those stereotypes. And in the prisons, Dee has said in a number of talks we've had, and obviously right on point, is that most of the folks that are in the prisons are coming out of the prisons. Right. So you hope they come out in a way that they're going to be benefits to the community, benefits to their family, and sadly we won't see the recidivism we sometimes do. So the best thing we can do is make sure the conditions they are encountering point them in that direction.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that, Mr. Craig, because I'd say about 8 years ago, so the audience could correct me, but about 8 years ago, former President Jeremy Travis of John Jay, as a matter of fact, wrote a book about what you're talking about in terms of the vast majority of people who are incarcerated actually do get out. And the number that he used at the time was a roughly 95%. And that shocked my students in corrections at John Jay. They would say, really? And I'd say, yeah. And so that's all the more reason why we need to take care of these people when they get out and provide the care that you're pushing. By the way, you're both initiating this with these organizations I mentioned, which is just so commendable. I thank you so much for that, because, I am a firm believer in seeing things holistically, that what one does has dots to all kinds of different avenues, and that we can't think in terms of isolation. It's like when we look at criminal justice, we can't just look at policing. We cannot just look at the courts, and we cannot just look at corrections. And when we look at corrections, we can't just say somebody's getting out and that's it. We have to take care of people, I think, so that they don't go back and that they don't become a menace to themselves and society. The three of us understand that. And you, Ms. Miller, are understanding it through a situation nobody would want to go through, right? And yet you got the message and you're delivering it. And I really applaud you for that. It's incredible.
Thank you.
You're welcome. My fifth question: why is empathy crucial in your book and in your life? Ms. Miller, what's your answer to that?
Well, empathy obviously is, the ability to understand and share, the feelings of other people. And for me, learning about my father's life, I had to talk, I talked to state employees and inmates that experienced the riot. But I think most importantly, in order to be empathetic and to get information, you have to not only hear it, but you have to absorb it. You have to hear it, and then you have to absorb it, and then you have to kind of decide, because not all the information that you're getting is often the truth. You get some bits and pieces, right? So you got to start putting kind of that puzzle together, which is what I did. But I think that empathy is huge. It's huge to have in your life. It's huge to have in my current position where I work with veterans who have been through trauma.
Right.
And are involved in the criminal justice system. But it's important when you're talking to, I think, anybody, is to who lives a different life than you do, and we all do. But I think empathy is a key, honestly, to a bit of world peace, if you will, because if we're not kind and empathetic to each other, how is that going to work? It's just not going to work. Right. But we need to kind of just meet people where they are, right? Yeah. And just work with that and do whatever we can for them to assist them, because for whatever reason, they're in a position where they can't maybe help themselves right now. So what do we do as a community to assist these people, to assist anyone?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that great answer. Mr. Craig, as a journalist, I would suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, that during your career, you have probably encountered some people that you've interviewed that have no empathy at all about whatever topic it is you're talking about.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, trust me, yes.
Yeah.
Well, and sadly, some of the, I mean, without getting into my whole career, I've interviewed a number of people that have done bad things, and some of them are people that, their life perhaps put them on that trajectory, and some were those that you just really can't understand how or why, and they don't seem to really care themselves as to how or why they did it, and you feel, we talk about prisons, and given the chance they would do it again. I mean, I've interviewed some of those folks too, and but as Dee so wonderfully said, I mean, empathy is just it's just the corner. It should be the cornerstone of so much what we do as individuals, as society, because it would give us a better world if we had more of it. There's no question in my mind. So.
Right. I bring it up. It sounds simplistic. It's not, and you both have explained it very well. One of the pieces that I am engaged in is constantly trying to understand the mind of the sociopath or the psychopath, because we know from studies that they lack empathy, and because I've worked with so many of them, I've come to the conclusion that they know what empathy is, but they'll use it when it suits them, and then they turn it off, and that's very disheartening to watch, particularly in a jail or prison setting. So we'll see. And we need to have people that work in the field as corrections officers to be empathetic as well. And, I say this to my students. I say, if you do not respect the person that you are guarding in the prison or the jail, don't take the position. I think that's, imperative. It's a mindset that I think the three of us are insisting needs to be there. And I agree with both of you that we're not hearing enough about it in conversations with people. And that's, again, another reason why I endorse this book so much, because empathy increases as you go through the book, and this transformation that you go through is just, I'm saying it again, but it's just great. And so we'll leave it at that.
Well, I mean, just a quick follow up on that. One thing I think that's beautiful about Dee's journey is, one, her empathy, but when she learns more of her father, and we learn more of her father through the book, we realize how empathetic a character he was toward inmates, just as you're saying.
Yeah.
That he was somebody that truly was concerned for their well-being.
Yeah.
And it really carried through the family. Yes.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, Mr. Craig, because I literally was sobbing when I read the section about, and forgive me, Ms. Miller, for having you to rehash this, but just for the audience sake, the part where he is, in bad shape because of what's been going on, and you have people from both sides of the fence helping. You have corrections officers, you have police, you have people who are incarcerated, all trying to come together to make sure that he makes it. And that's a real testament to human beings. It's great. Number 6. What lessons do we need to learn from your book that can transform the field of criminal justice? I want you to talk, if you would, please, the two of you, about the integration between policing and courts and corrections, because it all encompasses criminal justice, obviously. So, Mr. Craig, I think you wanted to speak.
Well, I think you just touched on it, just with the earlier question of empathy. I mean, there's, we can talk all that we want to about programs and what we do have and what we don't have and what we should have and what's been cut and what's been restored. Dee and I have talked about educational programs being cut in the prisons, despite the proof that they decrease recidivism. But at the core, I think it comes back to the very thing that you've touched on, and Dee too, is just the empathy factor and the recognition that these are human beings, and as we've said, most of them are going to come out. And if you forget that and you don't sort of craft the programs in a way that acknowledges that, you're not doing them any favors, and you're not doing the world that they come out to any favors. And that's kind of a big picture question, I know, and not really sort of the granular what programs count and what don't. But at the end of the day, you have to treat people as treat people, regardless of if they're, you know, behind the prison walls or on the other side. And hopefully if you do that, you know, we'll all be the better for it.
Yes, absolutely. Ms. Miller.
I think what Gary said is perfect. I mean, looking at, I mean, there's lots of, you know, lessons that we can take from Attica, and the way, you know, prisons are run and programs that are provided, I think is, you know, something we all need to consider. But I think from a much larger perspective, the issue of being, you know, human to each other, regardless of whether you're the correctional officer or the inmate, you know, is to understand that you're both here. You're both marking time in different segments of times, whether you're doing 8, 12s or life, right? And so there has to be, you know, some recognition that we're dealing with humans, and that, and I think again that the empathetic factor is something that has to be there, should be there.
Absolutely. What types of educational programs do you see in the prisons and jails when you are in there?
I see.
Yeah.
Do you want to go? I mean, vocation, there's, I mean, in Attica alone, I believe that there's 11 different vocational programs.
Right.
You know, there's educational programs, there's college. Every, as you probably know, every prisoner, if they didn't graduate from high school, they will get their GED while they're in there, and there's additional programs as well. There's, you know, obviously substance abuse programs, and we have facilities that have veterans dorms and things like that. I mean, very specific treatment for a very specific part of the population within a prison. I think those are the programs, and I got to tell you, the recidivism rate for our veterans that go into these particular pods within the Department of Corrections is incredibly low.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because they're getting this very specific treatment designed just for them. And I think that there's no reason why we can't design programs for that of other people, so that we can really help turn their lives around while they're there. They have to do the time. The court and the state says so. So while they're there, let's help them work through their trauma. Let's help them work through their issues, because they are going to come out. And my men and women come out. And then we are, as an agency, an additional backup system for them when they come out. We just don't take care of them during, you know, their criminal aspect, but when they come out, you know, what can I help you with? Do you need assistance with housing? So on. I mean, these are things that we have to do as a society. There's just, I mean, to ignore it is silly. It's there.
Right. Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I know from reading your book that both of you endorse education, and I think we would concur that education is a form of awareness. And the more aware we are of our options in life, the better off each individual is, and so is society. So for anybody in society to say, oh, they should not be educated is preposterous. You know, we just have to be careful how we word it with people and make sure that, you know, they're receptive to the idea, obviously. And that's why your book speaks so well to that. Mr. Craig, did you want to add something to this about education? You were talking about it earlier.
Well, yeah, I think it, as you said, I mean, that's obviously so key as to what we can do with the programs in the prisons. And Dee hit on something I think that's also worth sort of reiterating is the need for more on the reentry end. I mean, I think, you know, even if we have the best of opportunities for folks when they're inside, you know, a lot of them are going to come out to a sort of an unwelcoming world in some ways, whether it's job difficulties, whether it's going back to the very same neighborhoods and the very same households that perhaps gave rise to what put them in prison in the first place. So the sort of programs that Dee is talking about on the reentry end, you know, the post-incarceration are really in many ways just as important as what we're doing inside, I think.
No question about it. Right. And I have been part of grants and those types of incentives for people to change. And one of the points that that keeps coming up is about recidivism. And they'll judge whether or not a project is funded after several years by the recidivism rate. And, there are pros and cons to that for obvious reasons. But the reality is that, we want to make sure that the program, and particularly in the reentry end of it, is there. We have to have programs when people get out so that we can prevent recidivism. If we only let people out thinking that we've done everything we need on the inside, that's not good enough either. And I know you both agree on that. It just would be nice if there was more consciousness about that. But in summary, I'd like to say thus far that this whole point about education and awareness and making sure that people change in a positive light and giving them the resources to do that is so important. In the United States, I think you realize this, that we don't provide enough for reentry in terms of medical care and education and housing, college, all this mental health services, like you've both stressed. There isn't enough of that. I think that too, when we talk about criminal justice, do you both see a parallel between the type of education that is needed to make police officers a little bit more sensitive to what's going on? Many already are, there's no question. But for those who are not sensitive to the people they arrest, do you see a parallel, both of you, between the type of education they need and the type of education perhaps a corrections officer would also need if he or she was not being sensitive?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said earlier this, I think something about the respect for the people you're policing or the people you're watching over as a corrections officer. And many do have that sensitivity and that respect, but maybe I have to be honest, there are those who don't in both of those professions and in any profession. I mean, I can tell you reporters who don't have sympathy for the people they're reporting on, sadly. And I do think that whatever training, to use the buzzword, the sensitivity training or whatever, that you find that shows proven results with that, and is something that you just can't do enough of. I mean, I'm in a city that's in Rochester that's had its issues with, policing over the past year. And we had the Daniel Prude case with a man who
Right.
Black man who died, under restraint or shortly thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of cops in the city, and I can tell you, I know a number of them who are very respectful, even though their lives are very different than those they see in the city every day. Mm-hmm. But they're respectful. But I can tell you, I know a number of them that I personally don't think should be on the force because they don't have that same respect for the people they're policing. I mean, they see them, to use that term, the other, that's sort of what they see them as. Right. And then when you have that attitude, and that's what's, I think, remarkable, again, to return to Dee's journey, is how, her attitude was just the complete polar opposite of that attitude. Right. And it truly is necessary, especially in jobs like policing and corrections.
Absolutely. Your point is well taken, because really what you're talking about too, again, is that whole concept of empathy. And we, people who go into corrections need to have empathy. People who go into policing have to have empathy. People in the courts need to have empathy too. I think that's really important. Ms. Miller, did you want to add to this?
I think what Gary said is equally as important within, the corrections community. I mean, you have people who catch them and you have people who keep them, right? And so, when, I think in order for the system to work well on both sides, police officer and corrections, you have to have a factor of empathy for these people, who are, made a mistake, and now they're going to be, put into the Department of Corrections, and what are we going to do with them while they're there? These are all, huge topics. But I think, like you were saying, getting back down to the very basic would be empathy, I mean, that's like the bottom line, really. You have to care about people in order to do these jobs. And I do think police officers and correction officers do care about people. Right. But I think there's, there's obviously, some that are better at it than others.
Right. Like in any profession, obviously.
Exactly. Uh-huh.
Right. I find, what I find fascinating is the sheer number of parolees and probationers I'm working with right now who have tremendous empathy for the people that they harmed. They understand the role of law and order that the police must enforce. If I ask them, do we need to have police? they'll say absolutely. In fact, they'll be the first to say it, which I find really interesting. And it's always intrigued me at how many people who are in prison, who have been incarcerated, especially for long periods of time, actually seem to develop more empathy over time, which is great. I think if, you know, I don't want to generalize, but what I do find particularly in the jail system is that if you have somebody that's very, very young in there and hasn't been in there very long, they will look at things in a much more scattered, disorganized way and not have that empathy that we're talking about. And then over time, for many of them, it appears, which is great. And I don't think the American public really understands the level at which people who are in prison and on parole and probation actually do think about the fact that they made an impact in a very negative way towards somebody, and they do want to learn, they do want to change and do all these things we've been talking about. So what lessons do we need to learn from the New York State's Attica prison riot itself?
There's so many. I would say, you know, just off the top of my head, probably one of the first ones is that I think back then, administration would have done much better had they listened to the correction officers that are more or less the boots on the ground. You know, because there was a meeting several days before where, you know, they talked about the unrest that was in the prison. You know, corrections officers, they're the ones who have their ears to the ground, right? They know what's going on. They know when a particular set of individuals are acting differently, or they're talking differently, or they're talking to a different set of individuals that they probably wouldn't have before, that something is going on or something is likely to go on. And I think for the safety of everyone, they should have listened harder to the corrections officers rather than just saying, thank you very much for that. Now please return to your post. And then, you know, so many people lost their lives because of that.
The power of listening. Yeah, the power of listening. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Mr. Craig, what's your response?
As Dee said, there's so many. You know, if you go back to, you know, the days before the riot and the months before the riot and the year before the riot, you know, there's as Dee said, there was the corrections officers who sensed that things were going badly and sensed the unrest and they weren't listened to. That there were the conditions, obviously, that gave rise to the unrest, you know, whether it was, you know, just basic sanitary conditions of a shower a week, a roll of toilet paper a month, are the ones that are often mentioned. You know, the more sort of lasting, the medical conditions were not great for the inmates. There was some basic denial of everything from magazines to, you know, religious rights for Muslim inmates. So there's, you know, that sort of big picture is, you know, if you set up a system like that where you treat people like that, you know, you may end up with results that you don't want. And that's, you know, what gave rise to a lot of it. I think, you know, if you go forward to September 13th, 1971, when the state police stormed the prison, and I mean, this sounds, you know, just and shot the place up. I mean, that doesn't sound like an analytical term, but that's basically what happened. And, you know, and 39 people ended up dead, you know, 29 prisoners, 10 hostages. There's something to be said for patience. I mean, you know, you don't, you know, this sort of, we have to show we're, you know, we're the boss. We have to show we have control. We have to show our strength. Sometimes not everybody wins when you use that equation. And sometimes, and Deanne and I have talked to inmates. We've both talked to inmates who will tell you that they think another 24 hours and they were ready to give it up. I mean, it was not great conditions in the yard for anybody. I mean, it was raining, it was miserable. It's hard to think that going back to your cell, maybe better conditions than what they had in the yard. But, you know, we talked to a number of inmates that said, you know, there were issues, obviously, with negotiations that had become somewhat difficult to get by, but that we were pretty much ready to just, okay, let's settle with what we've got and move on. But instead, no, they had to have this sort of law and order taking of the police, and it just ended up with, you know, the worst tragedy in America's prison history. It did.
Right. And as a result of that, many claim that there was more, what's the word? It just got tougher in this country for people after that, and more people got incarcerated, and there was more of this attitude of lock them up and throw away the key attitude because of that. You could make that claim. I've read about that. I'm sure you both have as well. And it's sad. And again, this goes back to this case of empathy. It's very interesting how that weaves through this.
If you take sort of the historical trajectory of corrections, the other thing you have going on around the same time of Attica, and actually in New York, at least one of the same key players, Nelson Rockefeller, is the quote war on drugs, and this sort of decision that the best way to tackle the war on drugs is not through treatment, but just to put people in prison. So you had the Attica equation, maybe it's part of the the sort of continued. Then we saw the upward trajectory in corrections numbers for decades, and then but you factor in the war on drugs with that, and that was such a significant part of the increase in inmate numbers, state and federal.
Right, and I would suspect you both concur with me that it's important to look at that as a health issue, not a criminal issue. That if somebody is selling or distributing, same thing, or using drugs, it's a health issue. It needs to be looked at it that way. And there are certain countries, and particularly in Europe, that are very good at understanding that. And people get help and their lives don't get ruined by sitting in prison for umpteen numbers of years.
And we've kind of done that with the opioid issue. I mean, of course, the irony is the opioid issue cut across a lot of demographic lines that, crack and other didn't, 30 years ago. And we seemed willing to deal with opioids as a health issue. We seemed less willing to deal with crack and cocaine back then as a health issue, and more as an issue, just lock them up.
Absolutely. And it's interesting in my classes at CUNY, and particularly at John Jay, the students will ask, well, isn't that due to the fact that those people are white? And now we're looking at the issue, but they didn't with the other one. You could certainly make that claim with research studies. Ms. Miller, tell us about Corey, and why was he so crucial in your views about life?
Corey, was just, he's one of my dearest friends. We met when we were 14, in an indoor track event in Rochester, New York. And as he says in the book, he always says, the first time we met, it was like lightning in a bottle. I mean, we were very good friends, and probably could have been something much more, but I knew, I don't think he necessarily understood that, because he had an interesting upbringing. He was, he has a twin brother, and him and his twin brother, who are Black, were fostered by a white family. And he just didn't really kind of understand in the racism kind of thing, because it's kind of different for him. But it wasn't different for my family. It was pretty much black and white. I had, for a long time, my relationship with Corey kind of went underneath, kind of flew under the radar of my family. And then obviously, they found out, and, that's when things didn't go so well. But I knew that, if this relationship was to continue, eventually I would probably have to choose between my family and Corey. Which is very strange now, because when I think about that back then, thank God for evolution in people, including my parents, because Corey is a very welcome member of our close family now, and we will forever be linked, and we love each other very much. We obviously have married other people, but we will never not be out of each other's lives.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. I loved reading that.
I just sort of pick up on a part of what Dee said, because about evolution, and if you read the book, you see that her stepfather in particular was one who had the issues of race with Corey, and problems with Corey. And Dee, to her credit, when we sort of hashed out that part of the book, called her stepfather and read that to him, and she could tell you better than I, but his response, as Dee can probably say, was pretty much an acknowledgement of, yes, that's the way I was, but I'm not that way now. You talk about evolution. I think he's had his own evolution, which is admirable, and the lessons.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, Corey's story in your relationship is so great. Could you tell the audience, Ms. Miller, who Malcolm Bell was? And why was he so important in your life? And then, Mr. Craig, I'd like you to also follow up in terms of his impact in terms of how you view it as a journalist, et cetera.
Well, Malcolm Bell was a Harvard Law School grad, and he, spent many years in corporate law, and then he applied for this job in criminal law, which is interesting that he got the job. The job was with the New York State Attorney General's office as a special prosecutor, and essentially his job was to oversee and coordinate the prosecution of state police and state law enforcement for those who have committed crimes, including murder, during the retaking of the prison. So Malcolm had a big job, but I think that it's interesting that they hired him with absolutely no criminal experience whatsoever to do this enormous job, which I think is part of the state's ability to, get in there early and start, messing with things. But my issue with Malcolm way back when, and I tell it in the book, is that, John Hill, was convicted for the murder of my father. And he, his sentence was commuted in 1976 by Governor Hugh Carey. And part of the reasons why Malcolm and I kind of started out rough is because Malcolm had written a letter essentially to, Corrections and the Parole Board, after Kunstler asked him to write it, to basically say, hey, this guy's sentence has been commuted. His original sentence is done. He's available for parole. He should be going to parole, yet the prison system was kind of hanging on to him as somewhat of a punishment for, what he was actually sentenced for, which is murder. And I think that the state of New York was just trying to keep him in for as long as they possibly could. And Malcolm just said that that's against his rights. He should be released as everyone else was. Of course, back then I was thinking, no, he should stay in prison. But I had to work my way around the fact that this was a right that John Hill had, whether I liked it or not.
Mm-hmm.
His right was that he was to be paroled because he had his sentence commuted, and
Right.
he was only working off then his original. There's a lot of things in my book that I had to work myself around. I had to think it through and be reasonable and rational about how the law works. And even if I don't like it,
Yeah.
that's fine. So I just had to work my way around understanding these things that I did not have control of and how I was going to react to it. Because that sometimes is it in a nutshell, right? I mean, you can just like let it eat you alive and, and you be angry and, pissed off all the time and resentful, or you can be like, the law states that this individual can be out. I don't like it, but it is his right to be out in free society. And I had to work through things like that with Judge Zaleska in the case of the inmates as well. So, later on, John Hill gets to, file for, the inmate settlement. And I had to work my way around that when Judge Zaleska said, look, he has a right to file this claim. He was in the yard that day. I mean, I had to work my way around things. And sometimes, you have to accept it and work on yourself as to how you're going to deal with it.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Thank you for that. Mr. Craig, your response.
Well, Malcolm, as Dee said, he came into this job without any criminal experience. Makes you wonder if this was kind of setting up to fail, that they really didn't want a good prosecution of the state troopers and others. But Malcolm, if that was what they were thinking, they clearly underestimated the person they hired. He took it to heart. Malcolm has, the Out the Turkey Shoot, which really goes through the whole history. There's a later edition of it also. Mm-hmm. And Malcolm, to this day, Malcolm's 90 now, and he's like a go-to person for details of the uprising. We did the paper here and through Gannett, which is the chain for which I work. We did a big project on Attica on the 50th anniversary. And I was like constantly calling Malcolm just to make sure I had the facts right, because at age 90, he still knows them probably better than anybody. There's that part of him. And you talk about somebody who's empathetic and decent and kind and caring and loving. It's going to be hard to find anybody that has those attributes more than Malcolm Bell. So it's just a wonderful person. And just even separate from the whole Attica stuff, he's just a great person to know just because of who he is.
Right. And that comes through in the book, obviously. And I really encourage the audience to read the entire book for many reasons. And that's another reason. I mean, he just really stood out to me as well. And all these wonderful surprises in the book. I loved it. We are getting toward the end of our hour. And I just wanted to ask both of you, starting with Miss Miller, to just briefly add anything that you wanted to add at this point.
What would I add? I'm not sure. I think we've touched on it and you've said it. I mean, I think that, we need to be kind, caring human beings. We need to be able to be reasonable, and to be able to walk ourselves through it. And if we can't ourselves, then we have to ask for help. Like, I can't tell you how many times I called Malcolm Bell and said, I don't understand legally, so can you please explain this to me? And, you always have to have somebody, in your life that will literally, for me, it's many people, thank God, kind of walk you off that ledge when you get on it. Because, sometimes, you can be mad and stay mad, but really that's no good for anybody, right? It doesn't do any good for anybody. So I think being as open-minded as you can, I think choosing to try to be the best person that you can be. I think, a huge part of my life and what I've said to my children as I've raised those is that we have a responsibility in our communities to give back to other people and what it is that we choose to do for our jobs, and volunteerism. I mean, all these things are hugely important to me. And I think they just make our community and ourselves better. And why wouldn't you want to be better,
Right. Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you for that. Mr. Craig.
You're welcome.
That's a tough one to follow. It's so right.
It is. I believe you.
It's just so right on. And that's why I wanted to help Dee write the book. It's just, I think there's lessons for us individuals and community and society and her journey that just we can all learn from. And hopefully if we kind of embrace and find some ways to let it impact us, we'll all be the better for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I want to thank both of you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me today in this interview. And I want to just remind the audience of the name of the book. It's a wonderful book. It's called The Prison Guard's Daughter, My Journey Through Ashes of Attica. And I want to also close in honor of both of you and your families, as well as your father, Mr. Quinn. And I thank you so much for being here today. And I wish you both the best. I'm sure we'll be in touch and have a beautiful day. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching John Jay's official YouTube channel. Stay informed, stay connected, and join the conversation. Subscribe now.